All right, we're now looking at the challenge of Islam, the challenge that Islam poses to Christianity. Several decades ago, back in 1979, there was a Fort Wayne professor named C. George Fry who wrote an article for Christianity Today, back before Christianity Today became what it is today, entitled Christianity's Greatest Challenge. This is 1979, during the Cold War, when everybody assumed that the greatest threat to the Western free Christian world was communism, godless communism. He argued in Christianity Today that the greatest challenge to Christianity actually wasn't that, but was Islam. And letters to the editor, personal letters to him, had Christians, well-meaning Christians, saying, "How dare you say that? At least Muslims believe in God. Communists are atheists." He republished that essay, changed it just a teeny bit, or a tiny bit, in around 2005 in a CPH publication entitled something like The Theology of the Cross for the 21st Century, and began by explaining the history behind the article, and says one of the great things about living so long, I think he's in his late 80s now, is you get to see the people who besmirched you once refuted. Because it actually did prove, or it has proven and continues to prove, to be one of our greatest challenges. In a number of fronts. We could talk all night about terrorism and all these other things that we're well acquainted with, but I want to spend time talking about the particular theological challenge Islam poses. Especially, this isn't necessarily for you, but for you to tell other Christians, because what's happening, what has been happening for a while, is Christians have been slowly but surely pulled into this, I think it's kind of a trap, into saying things like Christians and Muslims worship the same God, and things like that. There's a very popular movement around right now called the Common Word, or A Common Word. They've got a website. Whether you've heard of it or not, I'm not sure, but trust me, it is extremely popular. High-profile theologians, some very respectable ones, like John Stott. I don't know that this is taped, so I got to be kind of careful because he lives in my neck of the woods, but Rick Warren, I say that begrudgingly, has signed on to it. And of course, the whole slew of liberals and everybody in between, but even some LCMS missiologists have signed on to this movement that was started around 2007. And what it was is Muslims got together in Jordan, in Amman, Jordan, 138 high-profile Muslim statesmen and scholars and theologians and so on. Basically, who's who in the zoo of Islam got together and put together a statement, a dawah, a call, addressing the Pope, patriarchs in the Orthodox churches, presidents, general secretaries, leaders of Christian churches everywhere, and sent it to those leaders all across the globe, every Christian tradition. And in this call, or this letter, this open letter, said to them, if we want to avoid the clash of civilizations that people have been sort of predicting, it behooves Muslims and Christians to think of ways to get along. And the document says, and in fact, they can get along. Because if you look at both of the traditions, the broad traditions, we see that there are two main themes in both traditions that are the same. Both traditions say, love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and they both teach love for the neighbor. And on this basis, they say we can, half of the world's population, about half of the world's population, Muslims and Christians can at least, they don't have to necessarily compromise their theology, their larger theological schemes or systems, but they can work together on things. Certainly social, and that might be true. You know, many Muslims are as abhorred by pornography as Christians are. And there are even Muslims who are as horrified by the rate of abortion in America. But the document goes further and says, it suggests that even religious Christians and Muslims can engage in religious endeavors, not necessarily worship or anything like that, though there are those who do that. And so they signed it and sent it to Christian leaders everywhere. And the response was pretty overwhelming. Of course, the ELCA presiding bishop at the time responded, basically falling all over himself, saying, oh yes, this is a wonderful thing. The Pope Benedict at that time responded, The way he responds, if you read into it, you realize that he's not all that for it, but it kind of seemed very conciliatory. But the one curious response that came pretty quickly was from a group of scholars out of the University of Yale, or Yale University, led by a famous theologian, not in our circles, but in broader Christian circles, named Miroslav Volf. And they drafted a response to this letter and quickly circulated it in different groups. I don't know how you get on these lists, these mailing lists, and got signatures from, again, these high-profile Christian theologians of different stripes, and published it in the New York Times. And there were about 400 signatures at first. To date, there's thousands and thousands of signatures, of Christian signatures, responding positively to this. But the letter from this group starts off by saying, "We thank the Muslims for initiating this conversation." Before we talk about the parameters of this common word, we first want to apologize to the Muslim world. We want to apologize to the Muslim world for the Crusades, because we're all culpable for that, something that happened 700 plus years ago. And we also want to apologize for the war on terror. Then it goes on, after that, and explains that the signers thought that it was a good thing that Muslims and Christians at least have some sort of dialogue, that they work at being authentic, that's the term they like to use, in their own particular traditions and worship of God, and also, just as importantly, work at loving each other. But the curious thing about the document is it assumes that both traditions, Islam and Christianity, have the same God, in some sense, and also the document refers to Muhammad as a capital P prophet. Here's how Muslims read that response by Christians. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. And I've seen a number of, my students always make fun of me because I'm always on these message boards. I've got a pseudonym, an Arab pseudonym, listening in on the conversations of Muslims and things. And they all, not all, I shouldn't say all, but a number of them thought that this was just a tremendous, not a trick, but a tremendous strategy that these Muslims from Jordan, or that congregated at Jordan in Jordan in 2007, because basically in issuing this dawah, as the Arabic document called it, this open letter as it's been translated in English, what they did was called those Christians to Islam. And the Christians, whether they recognize it or not, and whether they really say there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger is a different question, but the way they responded is exactly the way that Islam wanted them to respond, to acknowledge the veracity and the legitimacy of Islam. That's sort of the broad Christian context on Muslim-Christian dialogue, and theological and otherwise. So this conversation is for you, but it's also, I'm hoping that, I'm sure you have networks of Christian friends who aren't necessarily hardcore confessional Lutherans who read their Book of Concord every night, but maybe read Rick Warren's stuff or somebody else, so that you can make them aware of some of the shortcomings of these sorts of enterprises. So let's start with the theology of Islam. Essentially, Islam is a theological problem, because what it does, or what it asserts, is that Christian theology, as you and I confess it, as the broad Western Christian tradition has confessed it for hundreds and hundreds of years, is basically an innovation. It's something that was invented maybe by Paul. Some will say St. Paul invents it. He fuses, as one major Muslim theologian named Sayyid Qutb puts it, he fuses together Greco-Roman paganism with Jewish monotheism into this new combination. Most Muslim polemicists or apologists will say Christianity, the way we express it or confess it, is something that was developed starting around the 4th century at the Council of Nicaea. But before that time, Christianity didn't look like, theologically, like the Christianity you and I espouse. And what Islam then goes on to say is that the religion of Jesus, the religion of the first Christians, the religion of those before Jesus, the religion of Moses, the religion of Abraham, and the religion of Adam, the religion of all the prophets and patriarchs, and all who have been committed to worship of the one true God, while it may not have been named it, was in fact Islam. Adam's the first Muslim. The Quran says Abraham was, but it also suggests that Adam was. And it's not necessarily contradictory. It's a little, there's some paradoxes in the Quran. I think that fits under a paradox. But for Muslims, theologically speaking, while they have a history that appears in the historical record in the 7th century, for them, Islam doesn't begin in the 7th century. It begins when Adam and his consort, Eve, are forced out of the garden because they ate from a tree in the middle of the garden that they were told not to, and they were made to fall to earth. Because Allah is gracious, according to Muslim theologians, not only does he permit Adam and Eve to sort of work out their own salvation by doing what they know is right, he also, however, provides guidance to Adam and Eve by sending down his word, his revelation, through Adam first and through the various prophets. That revelation is eventually written down in books, culminating in the message of Muhammad in the Quran. So, and I assume Pastor Badawi will go into a lot more detail on this, but in short, for Muslims, Muhammad and the Quran are sort of the last expression of God's word, or what Muhammad said under inspiration was God's last will and testament. The Quran vouchsafes the revelation given by the Creator to all the prophets, culminating in Muhammad. For Muslims, however, the earlier prophets that are named in the Quran, that are named by Muslims as Muslim prophets, Adam, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, John the Baptist, there's several more of them, they were legitimate prophets of Allah, prophets of Islam. However, their message was corrupted. And so Allah had to raise up Muhammad and send down the Quran. So while Muslims can refer to the gospel, they can refer to the Torah, they can refer to the Psalms, they can refer to the patriarchs and prophets of the Old Testament, when they refer to them, they're basically just paying lip service to them. The material we have from Moses, the Torah, the Psalms of David, for them, for all intents and purposes, aren't really reliable anymore. They've been filled with corruptions. The gospel, and Muslims will interpret that a number of ways, has been horrendously corrupted. All the material in the Gospels that suggests Jesus was not just a special person, but the Son of God, is stuff that was added into the text later on. The Quran corrects everything. Quran is sometimes called Al-Furqan, which is the distinguisher between what is true and what is false. So if when a Muslim looks at the world, when he looks at Christianity, when he looks at the primary text of Christianity, the Old and the New Testament, he looks at it through the lens of, or she looks at it through the lens of the Quran. And the Quran essentially gives the Muslim, like the Bible does for Christians, a blueprint of how Muslims are to view things. And here's a quick accounting of the theological side of the Muslim worldview. It starts off with, in the center of Muslim theology is a confession of what they call Tawheed, the unicity or the oneness of God. Muslims are thoroughgoing monotheists. There is no God but Allah for them. When they say something like that, what they mean is they're not just saying God is God. They're saying there is nothing worthy of committing yourself to. Politically, legally, philosophically, nothing worthy of worshiping, no sports team worthy of following in comparison to, but God. He's the one thing that every person should be committed to. Many Muslims are, not always, but sometimes name their males Abdullah, which sometimes is translated servant of Allah. It actually means a slave of Allah. Some of the most important, influential Muslim theologians, Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, the Sheikh of Islam, as he's sometimes referred to. He's sort of the equivalent of Luther or Calvin or Thomas Aquinas in the Christian tradition for Islam, says that Muslims are to be slaves to Allah, commit every aspect of their life, their grooming habits, the way they dress, certainly the way they think about God and God's disposition towards human beings and everything else. They're to commit every aspect of their life to Allah. That's the center of their theology. They're monotheists, but they're a particular type of monotheists. You might call them Unitarian monotheists. For the Quran, God is one, but the Quran repeats in a couple instances that God does not have a son. So God is one in essence, but also one in person in Islam. He does not have any partners. There is no Trinity in Islam, according to the Quran, that is shirk. It's elevating created things to the status of deity. It's one of the most horrendous sins in Islam. In fact, people who commit shirk are called mushrikun. Quran chapter 9, verse 5 says that such people are to be killed. That's the first major point or doctrine in Islam, the unicity, the oneness, and the centrality of God. Second major doctrine, as it's traditionally put, is the tradition or the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, that is, from nothing. Muslims do, like most Christians, though that's, as you know, in many of the debates over the age of the earth and things, there are Christians who think differently about this, but most Muslims, like most Christians, believe there was a time when the universe or the cosmos and everything in it did not exist. The only thing that has existed for all eternity is God. At one point in time, well, before time, God starts calling things into existence. The Quran emphasizes that there's not just a physical side to creation, there's also an invisible side to creation. Not too foreign from our thinking, but it emphasizes that invisible aspect to creation is our angels and jinn, or genies. Not gin like Bombay Sapphire or the stuff you make martinis out of. I'm glad you laughed at that. I use that in class and nobody laughs at that. I don't think they know what jinn is. But so there are angels and there are jinn. And the angels and the jinn are still very active. There's a sense of the supernatural in many Muslims' lives. They believe, it's rendered differently, it depends on what Muslim you ask, but they believe that the angels or the jinn are recording everything they've done, good and everything bad in their life. And at the last day, the scrolls that these things were written down are going to be unraveled for all to see, but they're ever present. Sometimes Satan, who is a fallen, or who is a jinn, a genie, who was invited to the company of angels, but because he didn't submit wholly to Allah and disobeyed Allah's decrees, was forced out of there, and his name was changed to Satan. He's sometimes referred to as the great whisperer within Islam. And for Muslims, when people do bad things, it's not because they are inherently sinful, it's because things like Satan are whispering or leading people astray. So the bad things you do in life, the sin, and Islam can talk about sin, it means something entirely different by it. That stuff is not stuff you do because you're a sinner anyway. It's stuff you do because these supernatural things, genies, are tempting you away from the Sirata Mustaqim, the straight path that we all intuitively know because we're born by nature righteous. So that's the second point, the doctrine of creation. There's a lot of fascinating things in Islamic cosmology. We could maybe talk about that if there's time at the discussion or the roundtable discussion tomorrow, but I need to kind of make tracks. Third major doctrine in Islam is a belief, what we could call prophetology. I mentioned it a bit ago, but there's a strong emphasis on the fact that Muhammad is not just some new guy who pops up on the scene claiming to be a prophet, but rather is the end of a long train of prophets, all of whom were prophets of Allah. The Quran, in fact, chapter 19, verse 33, I believe it is, has Jesus right after he's born to the Virgin Mary. He's in the cradle, and he looks up and he sees his mother Mary is distraught because she's a virgin and she now has a child and she's got to go back to her family, and they're going to wonder how on earth did this happen if you aren't married. And Jesus looks up as maybe a couple-hour-old infant, looks up at Mary and says, "Don't worry, Mary, I'm a prophet of Allah." Even Jesus and other prophets that are named in the Quran, they refer to themselves as prophets of Allah. Muhammad's the tail end of this, but he's the one who recovers the corrupted recordings of these prophets in the text of the Quran. Corresponding to that is the fourth major emphasis in the Quran, as it's traditionally put, and that is a confession or a belief in the books of Allah. That the Quran is not just alone in being a book of God containing God's word, but there are books that were around before the Quran. The Quran names three of them: the Gospel, the Psalms of David, and the Torah of Moses. In one place, it also mentions some scrolls, some suhuf, of Abraham. Apparently they've gone lost. If you know Mormonism, I think it's in the Pearl of Great Price or Doctrines and Covenants. Apparently they've recovered it in the book of Abraham. But Muslims will talk, and Islamic theology says that at one point in time, they've got different theories to explain this, but at one point in time, the Psalms, the Torah before it, and the gospel was legitimate. It was a legitimate revelation from God, and it taught basically the message of Islam. How do they account for the differences between, say, the Quran and the gospel, or the Quran and the Torah? Like I mentioned earlier, they believe they've been corrupted over time. And it's interesting right now in Muslim Christian discourse. There's a lot of emphasis on this theme. I just wrote a little thing for this book Pastor Schultanis mentioned, Making a Case for Christianity, entitled Defending the Deity of Christ in the Face of Islam. And as I was doing the research for it, looking at all these Muslim writers on Christianity and their attacks on the doctrine of the deity of Christ, I was sort of flabbergasted, I think that's the right word, when I recognized that almost all of them say the reason why we deny the deity of Christ is not because we are biased against Jesus being not just fully human but also fully God, but because we don't think there's any good evidence for it. And then they go on and say because the texts that refer to Jesus as divine have been horribly corrupted. And here's where things get really interesting. They say, and this is what Bible scholars have been saying for a couple hundred years, confirming what Muslims have said for about 1,400 years. What they are doing is drawing on some of the liberal or the scholarship of higher criticism that I don't know if you all sit around reading works of higher critics on Friday nights, but on Easter morning or Christmas morning, you turn on the History Channel, sometimes called the Nazi Channel, or the Discovery Channel, and they're going to have an episode on the origins of Christianity or something like that, and you're going to have, of course, there are two celebrities that always appear, Bart Ehrman, who's made famous and very popular. You find his books in Costco or Sam's Club, that made famous the argument and the speculation that because there are some copyist errors in the manuscript tradition behind the New Testament, that must also therefore mean that there's been a lot of conspiracy, theological conspiracy that's made its way into the New Testament as well. That is, the New Testament is essentially corrupt. It's not trustworthy. So Bart Ehrman is a key source for Muslims in showing the corruption of the Bible. It's no longer just an open or a blank assertion that Muslims make. They're now using scholarship to demonstrate it. Another famous person they like to use is Elaine Pagels. I believe she's still at Princeton University. She certainly believes that the Gospels have been corrupted, textually corrupted, but she's made famous the claim that while Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and maybe the Gospel of Thomas are pretty early, there are also other ancient Gospels out there. You've perhaps heard of the Gnostic Gospels or the non-canonical Gospels. It's not just the Gospel of Thomas, but you've got the secret Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Peter, the Infancy Gospel, the Arabic Infancy Gospel. There's a whole slew of them. What she argues is, and what Muslims have argued, is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are just 4 Gospels amidst probably over 24 other Gospels that were written in the ancient world. That the early Christian church, somewhere along the line, maybe as late as the 3rd century, chose Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John was an arbitrary choice. It was chosen to support the theology of the ruling party that had political backing after the conversion of Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor in the Roman Empire. They arbitrarily pushed and marginalized those other ones. And she says, if we look at those other ones, we see that early Christianity was extremely diverse. Muslims pick up on that and say, yeah, we've been saying that all along too. And in fact, we think we have the original gospel from which all the others are redactions. It's called the Gospel of Barnabas. That was discovered in the early 20th century by scholars in England in 2 continental libraries. There are 3 manuscripts for it, 1 in Spanish and 2 in Italian, or it's 2 in Spanish and 1 in Italian. In the early 20th century, they looked at the text, translated it into English, wrote an introduction for the text, and basically proved that these manuscripts that make up the Gospel of Barnabas are at earliest, or was at earliest written by the 15th century. So written 1,400 years after Jesus' life. That the name Barnabas is attached as an author is just something to attempt to establish its legitimacy. Here's the curious thing, though. Muslims will take that thing that was published in 1907 that proves the Gospel of Barnabas is a historical curiosity, but certainly not to be taken seriously as an eyewitness account of Jesus' life. They will remove that scholarly introduction and just publish the Gospel of Barnabas. And if you read the Gospel of Barnabas, you have Jesus saying, "Behold, I give you good news of a prophet who's going to come after me named Muhammad." The Quran happens to say in chapter 61, verse 6, has Jesus saying, "I give you good tidings of a prophet who's going to come after me named Ahmed," which is another name for Muhammad. But any scholar worth their salt, even liberal scholars who would love to do damage to Christianity, recognize that the Gospel of Barnabas is a forgery from the late Middle Ages. Probably, and recently some research has been done that doesn't prove, but with a high degree of probability shows that the author was probably a Dominican monk who converted to Islam over in Istanbul in the days of the rise of the Ottoman Empire. Fascinating stuff, but for Muslims, this is something that you encounter, especially amidst younger Muslims, who are oftentimes very well educated, very well equipped for engaging in this sort of discourse with Christians. They will point out both the alleged textual corruption of the New Testament and also this sort of conspiracy theory that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John were favored over and against other Gospels that may have been more legitimate or not. If those things concern you, and maybe they do, I don't know, but it is true that, for example, many of you are accustomed to, in the Gospel of Mark at the ending, that last chapter, chapter 16, there's that chunk at the end where it says Christians are going to get bit by snakes and not be harmed and things like that. There's always a footnote that says this isn't found in the earliest manuscripts. There are things like that behind the history of the New Testament. None of them make a hill of beans worth of difference. I think that's a phrase from Texas, hill of beans worth of difference. We don't use it in California. We have more colorful language. None of them make a difference in terms of the historical veracity of the New Testament or the theological content of the text. But it's true that manuscripts, that monks through the Middle Ages, as they're copying the manuscript, who didn't have word processors or electricity, sometimes change the word order in the text, which doesn't matter in Latin or Greek or other inflected languages. It's true that sometimes they made a mistake. Instead of writing kai, they wrote kairos, very different word. But you expect these things looking at a manuscript tradition like the Bible that has over 5,000 Greek manuscripts. And if you compare or look at all the other manuscripts, you got almost 30,000 manuscripts behind that text. Nothing that historians are bothered about at all. And as far as the non-canonical Gospels, if it's the first time you've heard about them, there are other Gospels out there. The Gospel of Thomas, I mentioned some of the names of them, that are ancient documents. Don't be concerned. Every single one of them was written at the earliest in the late 2nd century. They're way too far removed to be eyewitness accounts or accounts written by people who knew eyewitnesses. They're ancient, but they're late. Their names were attached to them to establish their legitimacy primarily by Gnostic communities. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John didn't have names attached to them. Why? Everybody knew who wrote these things, and the authors weren't so much concerned with establishing their celebrity status, but they were interested in recording what is truthful, what is factual. Hence, they put in very embarrassing things like women being the first witnesses of the resurrection. You don't do that in 1st century Jerusalem, because a woman's testimony, sorry to say, ladies, is not worth a hill of beans in that time. They put it in there because they simply were the first eyewitnesses. So there are some challenges that from those evil professors at secular universities. I'm kidding about that, but some of them might be evil. That Muslims are drawing on, and if you hear about these things, they sound legitimate. If you're not aware of what's going on behind the scenes, they're not legitimate. Ask your pastor. Sorry, pastors, I Just gave you some more work. But they're just simply, from a historian's perspective, even if I were to, which is very difficult, but if I were to temporarily or hypothetically get myself out of faith, put behind all my faith commitments, I'd still come to the conclusion, as a historian working using his proper historical methodology, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are eyewitness accounts or accounts written by companions of the eyewitnesses, and the printed New Testament that we have today, the manuscript tradition behind it, is as solid as any other ancient document we have. In fact, it's much more solid than even the best ancient documents we have, like the authors like Suetonius or Josephus or Tacitus. More on that later, perhaps during the roundtable discussion. Last major point of Islamic theology that's a bit challenging is that Muslims, like they believe that time and space came into existence when God called it into existence, also believe there will be a last day. There are some interesting parallels. They don't really converge on each other, but parallels between Christian and Muslim eschatology. The Quran puts it this way, though, that on the last day, the angel Gabriel or Jibril is going to blow his trumpet, and every dead and living creature is going to rise up in the air. And they're all going to be judged on the basis of their good or bad deeds. The Quran's a little interesting here, though. In one place it says, if your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds as they're placed on these scales, then your salvation is all but certain. In other places, the Quran seems to suggest that your eternal fate is already established even before you're born. So you think Calvin and double predestination is strong? Islam is stronger. Or maybe they're the same. That's another conversation for a different day. Also, another curious thing in the eschatology of Islam is, while the dead will all be raised as well as the living and judged, the Quran in chapter 5 has this curious little depiction of what's going to happen to Christians in particular. That is, classic confessing Christians, Christians who will confess the Trinity and the deity of Christ. The picture is everybody's raised up and being judged. Presumably Christians, or it sort of assumes that Christians are going to be in one corner, the LCMS in a very far corner, assuming they're the only ones there. And, I'm kidding, that was bad, that was silly. And Allah is going to be judging everybody, and Muhammad is going to be raised up as well, as is Jesus. Or not raised from the dead, Jesus is going to come back. He never died according to Islam. And what Allah is going to say is he's going to point to the Christians and ask Jesus, saying to them, did you tell these people to take you as God? And Jesus turns his back on Christians and says, I would have never told them such a thing. So you get Jesus ultimately disowning Christianity at the end of the day in the Quranic view of things. That's the theology of Islam. There are parallels, and there are, of course, lots of liberal authors who love to exploit these parallels, but by and large, while it parallels Christianity, the end and the content of Islam is radically different than the Christian view of things. So how are Christians to deal with this? And there are lots of ways. We could, of course, just sort of hide out and not engage Muslims. We could just simply yell at Muslims and tell them they're wrong and we're right, or what have you. I would suggest, and the thing I want to try to convince you of, is that when it comes to Muslims, Christians, especially in America, where the Muslim population is growing and is becoming more mainstream, chances are many of you work with Muslims or live in the same neighborhood or perhaps even have Muslim friends. I think it's a golden opportunity for Christians to engage Muslims. There's a long history of Muslim-Christian agitation and mutual sort of like hatred and fear and suspicion. Though I don't necessarily like it, that in America, that things are a bit more open than they were before in the wake of 9/11, that Christians and Muslims are more and more engaging in conversation. I think it presents a golden opportunity for real classically minded confessional Christians to engage in those sorts of conversations and make a case for the gospel. How is this done? I would argue, and I used to be real gung-ho on this, I still am, but I'm a bit more realistic about it, but I do think there's a strong need within our circles in particular to recover the lost art of Christian apologetics. I assume many of you know what apologetics is, but in general, it's usually translated the defense of the Christian faith. I prefer regarding it as more of making a case, a positive case for the Christian faith. The defense of Christianity over and against adversaries is usually polemical. It becomes quite heated. And in a day and age, and trust me, come out to California, you'll see how wimpy people can be. But in a day and age where if you dare suggest somebody might not be right, and people start crying and claiming that they're being bullied and whatever else it is, polemics and heated arguments and things like that may have taken place in the past and maybe were fruitful in the past, I kind of think they aren't all that helpful anymore. So Christians need to be prepared to give not just to tear down Islam and poke holes in Islam, but to give, as Peter would, or as 1 Peter 3:15 says, to make a case or give a reason for the hope within them, rather than just saying I have faith because I have faith. I believe Christianity because I believe in Jesus because I have faith. That's true, and that's a wonderful confession, but for a Muslim who doesn't have that faith, who might be looking for a reason for why you have faith, it's not a good reason, I'm sorry to say. Because Muslims essentially say the same thing. Why are you a Muslim? Because I'm a Muslim. They get into this circular argument. And anytime, when Christians fall into this trap of accounting for their faith in public, in an apologetic setting, just by appealing to their faith, that circular reasoning is basically the same sort of reasoning every other religion uses. You put Christianity on the same epistemic or foundational footing as Buddhism. Why is it true? Because it's true. I don't think that certainly the Christian tradition doesn't operate that way, and I don't think the scriptures encourage Christians to defend Christianity that way. That approach to Christianity, though, that says we can give a good reason why one should consider Christ seriously, or why one should consider Christianity above any other sort of religion much more seriously, certainly is something Christians can do. Why is that? And how do you do that in a Muslim context? First and foremost, Christianity is the sort of religion, this is going to be shocking, don't set the sticks on fire out back yet, but Christianity is the sort of religion that might be false. What do I mean by that? It's the sort of religion that can be disproven. Is that shocking yet? It is shocking. Consider this, though. Easter morning. My dad used to do this. Now I start doing this when I teach Sunday school. I go into the class on Easter morning, and I kind of lie to the kids. I say, did you guys hear about the news report this morning? They found the tomb of Jesus. They found his bones. Isn't that great? We know Jesus existed now. And they get, wow, that is great. There's always a smart kid, though, at Faith Lutheran Church in Capistrano Beach and says, no, that's horrible for Christianity because it means it's a lie. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, it's a lie. It can be. Christianity's truthfulness is connected to real historical, empirical events. What events is Buddhism or Hinduism or any other ism? Even Islam to some extent, though it is historically based in a sense, none of them have anything going for it or going for those religions in terms of their connection to the real world. The earliest Christians, Clement, a late first century church father, said that the thing that emboldened the apostles to go out and preach the gospel and ultimately to meet an untimely death of a martyr was because they were convinced it's true because Jesus rose from the dead. It wasn't some burning in the bosom, some liver shiver, as my colleague Dr. Rosenblatt would call it, or some feeling or some comfort that they received from this message. That might be important, but most importantly, Jesus rose from the dead. Christians can argue for the factualness, the reasonableness of Christianity on the basis of these sorts of things. And in a Muslim context, I think we're situated perfectly to engage in that sort of context, especially as Lutherans, who have at the center of their theology Jesus crucified on a cross and risen from the dead. And here's how I kind of think about, and when I do have dialogues with Muslims, I try to get the conversation away from theology. That might seem shocking, but away from theology and focus the conversation on the historical Jesus. And the basic question I ask Muslims after I set it up is that we both say that we believe, in some sense of the word, in Jesus, that he existed, right? They say, yeah. Where we part ways, there are lots of places, but where we really part ways is over the question of whether he died on the cross or not. His death on the cross certainly has tremendous soteriological ramifications, absolutely, but it's also just a basic historical question. It's not loaded with all that theological baggage. It doesn't have to be loaded with all that theological baggage. And I simply ask the question, how do we know whether he died on a cross or not? And here's the typical response you get from the Muslim. The Quran says he wasn't. Response by Christians, well, we can certainly say, well, the Bible says he was, but probably a little more adequate response is, well, people who lived at the time, I actually saw it. We have eyewitness documentation of it. We have 2 eyewitnesses, Matthew and John. 2 companions of eyewitnesses, Mark and Luke. We have hostile witnesses, Roman authors like Tacitus and Suetonius. We have a hostile Jewish author who's not as hostile as he was in his earlier life, named Josephus. We even have the arrest warrant of Jesus. All this good historical evidence from the first century, good primary source evidence that says Jesus was crucified, just as a matter of historical fact, right? Then I say to the Muslim, so why is it you prefer the Quran? Right? Why is it you prefer a text that was put together in the 7th century, so 600 plus years after the event allegedly took place? And as one Muslim scholar responded to me, he said, you know I can't answer that, Adam. And I said, why can't you answer that? He says, because as a Muslim, I have to go with the Quran. But as a scholar, I should go with the evidence. And that doesn't, again, make a hill of beans worth of difference in terms of the salvation of that Muslim. But what it did do is expose the really shoddy foundations of some of the claims of Islam, that it is not found, there's no historical basis for believing it. I think Pastor Badawi will even get into some of the historical problems with the person of Muhammad. We'll wait for that tomorrow. But it's that type of argument, being acquainted with those sorts of apologetic arguments where you're able to get out of theology and more into history, looking at facts and evidence, keeping it centered on the person of Jesus. If you can establish that there's good reason that Jesus died on a cross, and I've encountered a number of Muslims who have come to the different position than the traditional Muslim position and said, okay, he probably did die on a cross. Doesn't do anything for their salvation, but it establishes something very helpful, because then the question is, a theological question, why was he crucified? And that's where you can actually start to speak the gospel to the Muslim. And as we know, especially as Lutherans, we confess, it's only the gospel that really, and the Spirit working in the speaking the gospel, that can really penetrate the darkness and the rigid worldview of Islam. In short, what I want you to take away from this is first and foremost that Islam and Christianity, while they may share some terminology and names and things like that, in no way, and I don't think I need to convince you of this, in no way do Islam and Christianity worship the same God, or Muslims and Christians. In no way are their theologies even at any point really the same. In fact, their theologies are sort of hostile to each other. Islam treats the theology of Islam as just a historical innovation, a cleverly devised myth, basically. The way to deal with that theological challenge is certain you can have conversations till you're blue in the face comparing and contrasting theologies, but if to make any sort of headway for Christians engaging Muslims, you've got to get that conversation to Jesus, and you've got to be prepared. It's not always necessary, but you've got to be prepared for that apologetic conversation, because more and more, as we move headlong into the 21st century, the conversations are becoming apologetic almost 100% of the time. Every conversation I've had with a Muslim in the last 10 years or so has shifted towards some sort of apologetic conversation. I've always found myself defending just the historical veracity of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I wish I didn't have to do it, but you do. And every conversation, if I can get there, when it gets to a conversation about Jesus and what he did, once that's dealt with, then finally a fruitful theological conversation can have. So that's all I wanted to leave you with. We have a roundtable discussion tomorrow. Maybe you've got a lot of questions churning in your mind. Please save them, because I think we have Vespers here soon for tomorrow, and we'll deal with them. I think it's at 11 o'clock. Thank you for your attention.